Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Russell here, and just yesterday, Freeland, the Finance Minister for Canada, well, she testified in front of the Federal Finance Committee, and they asked her a bunch of questions, like, why is the CRB being slashed from $500 a week down to $300 a week? How come student loans aren't just paused entirely during the pandemic? As well as questions from certain finance critics saying, hey, we've noticed that you're going to continue spending huge amounts of money, even if you see the economy recover. Why is that? And they also critique her on some comments that an actual ally of her party recently made that are negative regarding the budget that she just released. So in today's video, we're going to go over all of the most important questions and what she said in response, just to provide a little bit of context for you. But before we do, make sure to check out the link in the description where you can get 45% off the Canada Money Mastery Program, where we teach everything that you should have been taught in high school. We just put a section in that course all about house hacking and how you can save tons of money like that and start investing more. So if you're interested in it, check out the link and see if it's a good fit for you. All right, let's dive into this first question from Ed Fast, who's a little bit concerned about the way the liberals are actually tying an anchor to their spending and how it seems like no matter the circumstance, they're just willing to spend more and more and more.
So I guess my concern is this. We have better growth. We have higher government revenues in each of this year and next. Yet for some reason, you're not only spending all of the unexpected additional revenues, you're also increasing the amount you're going to borrow in each year. We're going backwards, big time. For every extra dollar that comes in revenues, you seem to think that you can spend that dollar and then borrow even more than you'd initially projected. So how is that a sustainable fiscal and debt management plan?
So some interesting criticisms here from the official critic of finance from the Conservative opposition government. He's essentially saying here, hey, we've noticed that since your last economic update to this new budget, well, you're actually projecting that Canada's going to have a better economic future, but you're actually going to spend more than you had planned on spending even when you thought that the growth was going to be lower. He says, hey, why does this make sense? Even if we're doing better as a country, why are we taking on more debt? And he sort of is critiquing here the Liberals' sort of anchor and their guideline for their spending, which is debt to GDP. Essentially, if we have more gross domestic product and we're producing more as a country, he's saying Liberals will just see that as an opportunity to say, hey, we have this much more growth. Hey, that means we're safe to spend this much more and take on this much more debt. Let's see what Freeland has to say in response.
When it comes to the growth projections, the budget is based on the average of forecasts of private sector economists. The projections of private sector economists have changed, and that's been what we've used as the basis of our fiscal track. And I am very confident that the spending in our budget is reasonable and sustainable. There are a couple of key markers that I would point people to. The first is that we show a declining debt to GDP ratio. It is not merely my judgment that the debt and deficit track is reasonable and sustainable. It's also the judgment of some important outside validators. On April 26th, they reaffirmed Canada's AAA credit rating, the highest there is, and said that the outlook was stable. That was after reviewing our budget.
So a couple interesting points here. First, she says, hey, we're not the ones making all of these projections for our growth for the future. We actually just take the average of all of the big banks in Canada. What are they saying is going to happen in the future? We take that average and we use that for our own projections. So she wants to make that clear. Then she goes on to say that, hey, as long as we keep this debt to GDP ratio solid, we are not going to change anything about the way we're doing things. Now, some economists will think, hey, yeah, this is a decent idea. And other people will say, well, this isn't actually the best way to look at it, and that's depending on who you listen to, really. Then she essentially says, well, don't just listen to me, look at what S&P said. They said that we're going to keep Canada's rating at AAA. This essentially measures, to simplify it, measures how strong structurally Canada's financial system is. S&P says, hey, we're going to keep it at a AAA rating, a very good rating, but they do say that they warn that it could potentially downgrade the country's credit rating in the next couple of years if the government's weakened fiscal health becomes significantly more severe and prolonged than we anticipate. So Chrystia Freeland is essentially saying here, well, as long as we have these external bodies saying, hey, what Canada's on the right track, well, we don't need to be worried about this debt to GDP anchor that we're using for all of our spending. And we're going to get to these comments that have been made about the student loan potential moratorium, as well as the changes to the CRB and what her responses were. But first, we need to take a look at Ed Fast and what he said, actually taking fire and putting the focus on Mark Carney. Now, this is somebody who's largely been a Liberal government ally. He actually spoke at their policy convention that was held just a month ago, and many people were saying, hey, is this someone who could potentially run for prime minister in the future for the Liberal government? Well, this person, Carney, well, he's making some negative comments about the way that this budget was rolled out, which is rather surprising when it comes to someone who's largely been in support of the Liberals in the past. Let me show you exactly how Chrystia Freeland responded to this.
So I'm glad you referred to outside validators, because I've got a few of those. For example, Mark Carney, someone who you know well, the former Bank of Canada governor. He said what we are seeing in some other jurisdictions is that the focus is more squarely on growth. Minister, your own fall economic statement and budget betray the reality that as you raise more money through tax revenues and otherwise, you're simply going to spend more and borrow more, but there's nothing to position our economy for long-term growth. This is a huge letdown. Why?
I disagree very strongly with all of your contentions just now. When it comes to outside validation of the budget and of the fact that our budget is on a sustainable and responsible fiscal track, from my perspective, there is no better judge than the credit ratings agencies, which are paid to assess the creditworthiness of borrowers. A week after the budget came out with a very strong endorsement reaffirming Canada's AAA credit rating and reaffirming that the outlook for Canada was stable. It really doesn't get better than that. The governor of the Bank of Canada, appointed by Prime Minister Harper, in whose cabinet you served, Stephen Poloz, he spoke about the fact that this sustainable plan was put together without a meaningful increase in taxes in any kind.
So essentially she responds saying, hey, I don't care what other individuals say. I'm going to keep looking at that credit rating, look at what the International Monetary Fund's saying about Canada, and use those as my indicators. But then she kind of goes back on that and gives Ed Fast a little bit of a similar treatment that he gave her, saying, hey, what about Stephen Poloz, the Bank of Canada governor that was appointed by Stephen Harper? He actually said some positive things about the budget. So if we are going to look at individuals, well, just look at that. This is someone who is actually brought into his position, his former position, now it's Tiff Macklem, but brought into his position by Stephen Harper, and he's talking positively about the budget. So if we want to look at this individual reaction to the budget, well, we can do that too, Chrystia Freeland says. Now, when it comes to putting pressure on Chrystia Freeland in terms of the CRB changes, as well as the, in some people's eyes, not drastic enough help for students, well, there's only really one party in this committee meeting, at least, that puts any meaningful pressure on Chrystia Freeland, and that is the NDP. Let me show you what they questioned about the CRB, as well as this interest on student loans decision that was inside of the budget.
Hundreds of thousands of Canadians have not been able to return to work, and yet Bill C-30 slashes in just a few weeks' time as the third wave crashes on our shores, the most devastating wave yet, from $500 a week to $300 a week. At the same time, it does nothing to address the fact that Canadian students are having to pay back student loans in a pandemic. So will the government accept amendments both to ensure that the CRB is not slashed from $500 to $300 in the midst of a pandemic, and that students actually get a debt moratorium so they're not having to pay back a student loan in the middle of this crisis? I
do believe that this budget provides unprecedented support for students and for young Canadians, more than $5 billion of support for young Canadians, the interest moratorium, and also in lowering the amount and raising the income threshold at which Canadian students need to begin repaying their loan after they graduate. I'm happy to talk about the CRB later on if you would like.
So she doesn't have an opportunity here to answer that question about the CRB. Peter Julian of the NDP sort of pressing, saying, hey, things still aren't looking that great out here. Why are we cutting benefits to people? Well, I'm going to show you comments that are later in this that has a little bit more clarity on why they're thinking what they're thinking, or maybe they don't have an entirely good reason to do this based on their research. But she does provide an interesting point when it comes to the student loan interest forgiveness, right? Right now, we have a pause if this Bill C-30 goes through until 2023 so that students don't have to pay interest on their student loans. Peter Julian of the NDP here is saying, hey, why don't we just pause student loans altogether? Chrystia Freeland responds saying, well, we're not quite doing that, but we are raising the level of income that a student would have to in order to have to be forced to begin paying their student loans. Right now, so long as you are under a certain income threshold relative to the amount you have to pay on your student loan versus your income, well, you don't actually have to start paying back your student loan and you're not charged interest on it. So she's saying, hey, we're taking care of the most hard-hit students by raising this level so that more people can qualify for this sort of moratorium in the meantime before they raise their incomes in their jobs. But then about an hour later into this committee meeting, well, Chrystia Freeland, she only stayed for the first half, so she has left at this point, but the Department of Finance, the representatives from them, are still there, and Peter Julian, this NDP member of parliament, is able to ask them, hey, how much research have you actually done about the effects of lowering this CRB amount? Like, do you really know how this is going to affect certain Canadians? And the response might be a little bit concerning for you. Let me show you what I'm talking about.
I'm wondering what the analysis of the finance ministry has been of the impact of reducing the CRB from $500 a week to $300 a week in July. How many people at this point do you assume will be on CRB if the third wave increases? What is the range? Highest level with a tragic escalation of the third wave, and lowest level? That would be my first question.
I'm afraid I don't have the estimates at hand on the projected number of people who we would think would be qualifying for the CERB in the coming weeks. Obviously, there's a great deal of uncertainty on that. But I could take that back to see what, if anything, we can provide you.
Thank you. I'm looking at the analysis on the range, right? We're in the midst of a third wave. It's growing in parts of the country, as we know. So it's not something that should be slashed without a great deal of thought. So the analysis done by the finance ministry would be very helpful.
So again, Peter Julian asks, like, how many people are going to be on the CRB? How many people is this going to impact? What are the effects of lowering this amount? And this representative from the Department of Finance, who's like sort of working underneath Chrystia Freeland, well, he says, well, I don't really have the numbers on what that looks like right now. He says he doesn't have them on hand, but it makes you wonder, do they actually have data on what this is going to look like? Or is he just saying, okay, like, I'm going to go back and try to find out a way to provide this data? We don't have answers to these questions yet, but Peter Julian makes the point, well, like, you're making a change for a lot of people's lives. Wouldn't it be important to have some data on how this is going to affect people? Obviously, the NDP are a little bit concerned about the fact that, well, they're not providing data backing up their decision to lower this amount when much of the country is struggling with a third wave. Now, how much this is really going to impact people going on past the September end of the CRB program, well, we don't really know, right? Depending on how bad the pandemic is currently at that stage and what restrictions look like, well, we could have recovered a lot, job numbers could be up, but also at the same time, we could be still struggling, right? It's so uncertain, and that's sort of what they're hinting at here, that, hey, you shouldn't make a decision around this lowering of benefits until we actually have some more data on what's going to be happening going forward. It's a little bit premature to make this decision. This is essentially what the NDP are saying. And I'm curious, what do you think about all of this? We touched on the spending of the Canadian government, how they're planning on financing that, the student loan pause, and how that should be handled, as well as this CRB reduction potential extension, right, at the end of September that they're trying to get passed in this Bill C-30. What do you think of it all? I know there's so many opinions on this topic. Let me know down in the comments, and I try to read as many as I possibly can and reply to a bunch of them. And while you're down there, make sure to take a look at the coupon code INVEST to get 45% off the Canada Money Mastery Program. When it comes to these income supports, they've certainly been helpful over the course of the pandemic, but when we get back to a time when there may not be supports like this, is. It's so important to know how to earn more, how to save more, and how to invest that to set yourself up to have a solid financial future. So if you haven't already taken a minute to take a look at that link, check it out, see if it's a good fit for you, and I'd love to see you in there. But with all of that said, thank you so much for watching, everybody. I hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.
This channel is supported by viewers like you. Thanks, channel members.